Hello and welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I am Carl Christensen, joined tonight by Tim, the lead lemming Cox.
The lead lemming. That's sensible. And
Well,
that
is
was
it
my
sensible?
Well, for the lead lemming, it is. Think of the power you feel at having everyone following you. You could do whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for being the lead lemming, right? Like lemmings generally get a bad rap because of the whole cliff jumping situation, but at least you're the one in charge, right?
That's right. I'm not a follower. You know, I take my fate into my own hands and leap bravely into the unknown. Yeah. Everyone else is just a stooge following the tailbeat in front of them. So yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
we
All right.
had to do one on misconceptions about wildlife. I was just reading the other day about how the false notions about piranhas and like how it's not exactly what we've been given to understand. Anyway.
Well, okay. I might question the whole lemmings constantly jumping off cliff thing. That might be a folk story, but I'm not going to trust anyone that tells me piranhas aren't dangerous. So,
In fact, I propose we do an on-site debunking episode in the Amazon where we jump into the water and prove to the world that it's
okay.
false.
I don't think we're going to do that, though I do think that would probably up our YouTube views substantially.
Undoubtedly. You first. You're a stronger swimmer.
Yeah, swimming a piranha. Okay. Tonight, the podcast is going to be about creoles, Creole languages. We are a bit late for this podcast. Usually we release them every 2 weeks. This one's a little late, and it is, of course, Tim's fault.
I don't mind taking the blame, actually.
Once again, the lead lemming. I mean,
that's right. Well, and that's the thing. When it was my shift for jumping off the cliff, I was so late I missed it, and I'm still here.
That's right. Okay, Creole languages. Let's do a little bit of background here. So my degree is in linguistics, so I have some knowledge about this. I also learned a Creole language when I was living in Suriname. To some extent, obviously, I'm not a native speaker of Sonoran-Tongo, but it is a language at which I'm cursorily, a little bit more than cursorily familiar. But Creole languages are very unique and very interesting. Tim, I believe you're reading a book or recently finished a book about Creole languages, correct?
Yes. And I'll maybe share some things from it. The author, by the way, John McWhorter, super cool, really knowledgeable about languages. He's like, he teaches something at some Ivy League place, whatever. And,
that's
he knows
good information. It should be really easy to look it up now.
What you know about what you should expect from our podcast. Associate Professor of Linguistics at UC Berkeley. There you go. So
okay, there we go. There's the UC Berkeley has some credibility. So good to get that. So Tim has some information that might be useful, which is better than usual. So. No. Okay. Let's talk. First of all, the word Creole. I feel like there's some confusion. Generally, people associate when we just talk about a Creole language, people jump automatically. At least where I live in the United States, they think automatically Haitian Creole. The word Creole, though, is more of a family of languages. And I thought it would be also useful to know that the word Creole comes from a Latin word, which I don't feel like I should actually try to say. But it sounds kind of creare, whatever. Anyway, it's a Latin.
You what? What is it?
Yeah, I'm trying to find my notes here. It is creare. Is that maybe?
Spell it for me.
CRIAR.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable.
Oh, actually, sorry.
I don't speak Latin, but
oh, sorry, that's not the Latin form. I took a note on. The Latin form is CREARE.
Creare. Yeah.
Creare. There we go. Creare. Anyway, it means to create. And so that gives you a little bit of insight into the kind of languages that we're talking about here. These are languages that have been created in particular circumstances. And so let's talk a little bit about the history of language.
And I'm gonna challenge that etymology just on my Insta research here. That I'm looking up I just searched etymology Creole, and like I think it's actually was originally describing the people who maybe spoke it. Would that? Do you think
I
that
don't know. I did see some different etymologies for this word. I always default to the Wikipedia one. People really throw Wikipedia under the bus, but when you have a whole lot of people that have editing rights, and generally people that are interested in editing are people that are knowledge. Anyway, I don't know that it is the case that the etymology for the word Creole in the article on Wikipedia about Creole languages is the correct etymology. It is one of a few, but this one does seem to make sense. So I don't know.
I'll offer just a little more on the story based on NewOrleans.com. You know, what a lot of at least Americans think when they think Creole, but that the word derives from Criollo, variation of the Spanish verb criar, meaning to raise or bring up, originally referred to New World born offspring of Old World born parents. And as a Spanish teacher, I can vouch for that Criollo would have been a Spaniard family comes to the New World, and the children born there in the New World had that status. It was actually a real pretty complex caste system based on your origin and
Right.
your genetics and so forth in the colonial world. Anyways,
it is the case that I know that when I lived in Suriname, people are, I mean, even in Suriname, people are referred to as Creole people. So it is something that's associated with people and language, whether or not they have the same or different etymologies, or with the name for the languages came from the name for the people. I don't know. But the word, what we can certainly establish is that there is a word in Latin that does mean to create, that supposedly gave rise to the words in the word in Spanish, which then may have, according to Tim's etymology, then led to the naming of the people, and then led to the naming of the language. Anyway, but let's talk real quickly. This is going to be a short podcast, but we're going to talk briefly about the history of normal language change. If you're familiar with history, you see language change all over the place, and for a variety of reasons. Conquest, war, generally the biggest language changes come because of that. But then, I mean, just anywhere around the borders, where you are mixing with people that speak a different language, that's going to influence the language that you speak. And so then you get loan words. You get bilingual speakers that are having an effect on the language, and then you have natural processes inside a language that create new words that shorten or change how particular syntactic structures are made in language. So there are natural language processes that can change your language from within, and there are changes to a language from externally as well. And so that's how you get a language that has a kind of a very unique flavor, even though it comes from a language. If you're looking at all the European Romance languages, Tim, you speak French. No, you don't. You speak Spanish.
Really?
Your French and Spanish are not mutually intelligible.
Yeah. Well, it's I always tell people, if there are no other French speakers in the room, then I speak very good French.
Okay, exactly. So, and those languages, changed over the course of hundreds and 1,000 years or whatever from Latin, but they came from the same parent mother tongue, and they just. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to insert a comparison that I use for my students. Whenever they wonder why is it said that way, or why is there this exception in the rule? Every language has exceptions and quirks and stuff. And I tell them it's like a vine. Language is organic. And actually, when you come and think about it, it's the only man-made thing that is also organic. And as such,
I mean, Johnny would say that, you know, the
people,
variety of things that the things that come out of your gut are probably organic.
okay, fair enough. but mine's the best one because but anyways, so these things, yeah, occurring naturally. Think of a vine growing up a wall. Each, you know, you plant 3 different vines in 3 spots along the wall. They're all from the same, you know, parent plant, and they're each going to take a different shape and grow in a different direction. That's what happens naturally with language. Anyways, and languages, families are often written actually or described as trees and branches and so forth.
Right. Yeah, and you can trace it all the way back to like Proto-Indo-European. There's supposed to be a language from which all European languages sprang. That, you know, takes you well pre-Latin. Anyway, but we're not going to talk all about language history right now. I just wanted the basic understanding of, okay, that's how languages change internally and with some external influence. The Creole language is different than that in kind of the fundamental way that it doesn't kind of grow from one language organically. It is a new created language that is influenced by at least two, usually more than that, other languages. And so let's talk a little bit about the Creole formation. Now, I read a little bit about, and like I said, I'm familiar, I've studied this as well, but I read tonight that some linguists believe that a pidgin isn't necessary before a Creole. I don't understand that. I don't apparently haven't done enough reading about the linguists that are in this school of thought, but I do think they're in the minority generally. But in order to form a Creole language, the thing that forms first is what's called a pidgin language. And by that, we do not mean pigeon as in the variety that Tim feeds when he goes to New York. Right, Tim?
Well, New York, London, cheaper in London. It's only tuppence, but
tuppence. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. This is a type of language. A pidgin language is a language that gets formed as a result of language contact and the need to communicate across language barriers. So often formed in seaports, 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, where you'd have people speaking an African language and French, or you're a Dutch and another African language, or English, and anyway, a variety of different languages coming in contact, and we need to be able to communicate in order to sell goods, to barter, whatever else. And so you now are creating a particular set of words that people are able to communicate with, and the basics forming of a language. The pidgin language, though, is unique in that there are no native speakers of a pidgin language. You just learn it in order to, do some task. Like I said, in most cases, it's some type of, economic transaction, or working with people. So the sorry, what was that, Tim?
Oh, sorry. I'll just put in and like 90% of what I'm sharing is from this book I'm reading by James McWhorter. So I'll just kind of just assume that everything I say is from him. But he actually shares an example that at least a lot of Western people will be familiar with. You actually have seen pidgin languages just depicted if you've watched an old Western movie. Footnote here, obviously there's lots of problems with Western depictions of Native Americans and stereotypes and so forth. So don't presume to think that the language that people are speaking in those Westerns is an accurate depiction of true pidgins, but there is actually some correlation where, so like this idea that this stripped down language where you just have a handful of adjectives, maybe one or two prepositions, and then, basic words, like, heap, big, whatever. That if you've heard something like that depicted in a Western, what you're seeing is Hollywood's anguished depiction of a pidgin language communication, because they're on the in the 1800s, and in the United States West, in the kind of frontier, there was a need at the situation that Carl described. You had people of various language backgrounds all needing to communicate and kind of hash jobbing together a language. I'll repeat that so you can cut out the Alexa in the background here. But you have populations in flux with a lot of people with different language backgrounds needing to communicate, and so kind of creating this shared, stripped down, super basic language to communicate. And so, anyways, you've seen it depicted in Hollywood. That's what we're talking about, the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about a pidgin language.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so pidgins are certainly unique in a lot of ways from the just kind of the aspects that we were outlining, and what we're going to now talk about a little bit is the way that a pidgin becomes a Creole language. So we talked about how pidgin languages are transactional, right? The idea that I need something done, and so I'm going to use this limited set of words and structures, language structures, in order to get a job done. But as we all know, that's not how languages work. Not how L1. L1 stands for your first language, as opposed to L2 or whatever other number of languages that you might be familiar with. Your native language, your L1 is how you think. It's how you process. It's how you interact with the world around you. And so, in order for a pidgin to become that, more is required, right? Language needs to move from transactional to just the whole experience. And so once you start having children that are learning a pidgin language as their first language, that is when all of a sudden you see unique linguistic aspects coming up, abstract ideas being discussed, and all the syntactic, morphological, and lexical elements of a full-fledged language. And so that is when we move from being a pidgin language to a Creole language. Tim, is that what Dr. McWhorter told you as well?
Well, somewhat. He said that the kind of the children aspect is generally an oversimplification, because it's technically not necessarily, and in fact, a Creole language or a pidgin can shift to Creole with adult speakers if they are, if they're using it in a situation where it becomes not just a transactional language but a lingua franca. I think in practice, or that's probably a technicality that would only interest linguists. I think in practice, in the real world, the line there is blurry anyways, because as those adults are adopting the language for everyday use and not just for transactions in a community, it becomes, does it become a Creole at this moment or at this moment? Well, yes.
Right.
But
right.
The bottom line is that, when the language no longer becomes a rude instrument to affect a transaction or take care of business, but rather a language which is used to express the whole range of human emotions and experiences, at that point it becomes a Creole. And as it does so, it acquires all of the grammatical and other trappings that define a language.
Right. And that, I guess, that is a useful distinction, and I would trust Dr. McWhorter more than I would trust me. That said, I think until a language is spoken natively, even if I'm using it as a more a lingua franca, there is still something to be said for a person that is using that language in their mind, as opposed to someone that is still just interacting with the world around, but still thinking Portuguese, still thinking French. As soon as it becomes the language of the mind, your mind's going to do the language takes on a new structure, I guess is my point.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, Dr. McWhorter would probably tell me something about that as well. So,
I think in
okay.
practice, though, the definition that you gave is logical and accurate.
Right. Okay. A few things about Creole languages, a few linguistic. These are kind of rules of thumb. I don't know if they apply to every single Creole language out there, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the number of Creole languages that exist and how many speakers there are. But kind of as a general rule, Creole languages have a particular set of linguistic characteristics that I think is unique, and I was going to touch on a few of them. Says Creole languages are generally characterized by smaller inventories of sounds, especially consonants, than the languages which they were presumably based on. So that's a unique, interesting fact about Creole languages. Absence of so there's. Sorry, what was that, Tim?
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that makes sense when you think about how a Creole forms. You've got people coming together from different language backgrounds, and as you do so, you're cobbling together. You kind of need to get the lowest common denominators. So if a large portion of speakers don't use the TH sound, then that TH sound will likely not filter out and not be in the Creole. And then if another group doesn't use the the glottal R or whatever the back of the throat R, then that will filter out. And so you're left with just a simplified representation of what all these sounds that humans can make.
Right. And that's kind of, I guess, the rule across all of these things I'm about to list here is that we're trying to distill these basic rules which we can all agree on and we can all make use of that might not exist in our in our various mother tongues, and they're being distilled into a pidgin, which is then grows back out into a Creole, but still lacks these characteristics which you'd see in most of these mother tongues. So the small inventory of sounds, and then absence of consonant clusters. So yeah, that makes sense as well. Consonant cluster sounds are anytime where you have 3 consecutive non-vowel sounds. It's pretty unique to a language, and often difficult for non-native speakers of the language to create that sequence of consonants. So that's one that would fall by the wayside. And lack of tones. In English, we don't do a lot, at least not in some ways. We don't do at least the difference in lexical meaning in words. But the lack of tones in holds true to pidgin languages as well. So as far as grammar goes, it says Creole grammars are generally simpler than the grammars of the languages in which they were originally based. There's usually an absence of number, gender, and case marking in nouns and adjectives. So once again, in English, most of our listeners obviously have English as their native language, not particularly familiar with number, gender, or case markings. Tim, how do you teach case, or do you teach case to your students?
No, I mean I teach Spanish 1, and I've dabbled a little in teaching Spanish 2, so we don't really get too complex. I mean, usually if there's anything that, fortunately, going from English to Spanish, they are similar enough that I can usually reference something in the English language that's, similar to from Spanish that's similar to English. But in any case, yeah, we just so sorry to disappoint you there, but
No, that's I didn't think you would. That I guess my point is that to children, case is I mean, it's complicated, and we're not even going to dive into it further here, other than it's a particular way that you form words in order to give you kind of syntactic information. And so,
what would a good example be for English speakers?
I mean, the various ways that we create pronouns, I guess, but it's different than case would be like in German or
Latin.
Right. So I don't teach this. I'm familiar with case in as much as I've studied linguistics and I speak.
And let me make sure that I'm getting this right. So case. So for example, if like a noun is a subject or an object. So for example, if I punched the bag versus the bag punched me, I guess that's not a very good example. Would that be a?
Are you frequently punched
really
by bags?
Weird example either way.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of something that wouldn't be offensive or get me into trouble.
Gotta watch out for
those
the bag
bags.
lobby.
Yeah. I mean that a very basic. Yeah. I mean there's in some languages there's accusative, there's subjective. There's lots of different cases. And I'm honestly not familiar with them because my L2, which is Dutch, very basic case structure as well, very little. It's kind of lost that over the years versus your Germanic, which has more casing. Anyway, but not to belabor the point, we're learn it from a layman here. Let's just say that some of these more complex part of language are once again being left to the side in grammar. So it does say that Creole grammars can sometimes have fairly complex systems of personal pronouns, which kind of surprises me. It's not what I'm familiar with in the Creole that I'm familiar with, but that's what I read. So I think it's obviously true. Invariant verb forms, so verb forms that don't change, and they're derived from the infinitive or based on the least marked finite verb form, and that I am familiar. So the in Soranantongo, like love is lobi, and loved, there you don't conjugate the verb. The verb is always lobi.
And the verb, and that I think is true of Creoles all around. The verb is then modified by markers, right? Like know. I have, and which actually not too foreign from English. I have run, I will run, I can't, those are, we are doing the same thing there. We're not conjugating the verb like you wouldn't say a Romance language where, each of those would have a different conjugated form.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But Soranantongo doesn't. I mean, there is no conjugation for any of the variety. Like we love, all of that is just lobi. So you don't have to worry about that.
Oh, what? Sorry, I was just going to stop and just to offer a word of caution to our listeners. This talking about how Creoles in general tend to be simpler than other languages is not to say that they're any less a language than other languages. I think we learn from these that language, there is complexity in language, but not always the same kind of complexity. So just because these languages generally tend not to have tone or tend not to have some of these other things that you see being quite rich and complex in other languages, they're still just as much a language.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that's something I learned, you learn early in linguistics if you're studying it in college is we don't try to take, we're not judging languages, we're observing languages We're trying to figure out how languages work. We're not trying to pass judgments on whether or not a particular form of a language is, yeah, like some people are stupider. I mean, that's silly. It becomes just, it's silliness when you're just trying to observe how languages are used, because they are tools, and so we're trying to observe and figure out what the language rules are and how they work. So yeah, we're not trying to pass any judgment on whether or not the language is. There is no judgment to be passed. It's literally just observations about the form of the language. So
Yeah.
Yeah, good point, Tim. Okay, one or two last things, and then we're going to move on to the number of languages, Creole languages, and the number of speakers, which I think is useful and interesting information. So, but just a couple more things. The negative particles are placed before the verb in Creole, almost all Creole languages, and that's not obviously always the case in other languages. And then fixed word order with no inversion in questions. So instead of "Are you going?" it's "You going on vacation?" You know, so you're not seeing that type of word swapping in the syntactic structure of Creole languages. So, and then the last thing is just vocabulary is restricted. Words in Creole languages usually have a greater range of meanings than in the language in which they were borrowed from. So that is also my experience in Sonanandongo is, yeah, I mean, one word can just a host of different, and in some ways that's super nice when you're learning it, but it does mean that there's a lot of context around it. You've got to understand the whole sentence. Anyway, but it is it's.
Okay. I was going to say this is often why Creoles are misunderstood, and people think, oh, that's just uneducated English or whatever, because they hear these words and they say, oh yeah, that's all English words, but they're just saying it wrong. And what they're not understanding is that those words have been co-opted or borrowed and are now being used in a different way to serve a different purpose. And anyways, it's that's
Yeah,
a common misconception with Creoles.
Yeah, let me give a quick anecdote here before we then talk a little bit about the numbers. As I was going down to Suriname, this is obviously many years ago now, but I had learned Dutch, and I had expected that I would be using Dutch. I knew that there was a Creole language spoken down there. I didn't yet know the ubiquity, and I think I knew it was technically the lingua franca, but I was 19. I don't think I knew what lingua franca meant. So I'm sitting in the airport. I've studied Dutch. I feel pretty good about my Dutch. I mean, as much as you can as a 19-year-old whose first language is English. But I felt like I'd be okay with my Dutch. And obviously I'm an English speaker. So I'm sitting there, flying from Trinidad to Suriname, and there's a family behind me who's just talking, and I'm hearing some Dutch. I'm hearing some English, and I am petrified because I had no idea what they were saying. And this is one of those cases where I've heard other people, if they're doing a study abroad or whatever the case might be, where you think that maybe you've learned the wrong language, or you're completely and woefully unprepared. And so I'm thinking I'm an idiot. I've studied the wrong language. I'm incapable, and I should probably just give up. Luckily, I had a companion that was with me traveling, and he told me that and he was familiar. He said that's Sonantongo. That's that Creole language, which is an English-based Creole, with a lot of Dutch influence. And so it isn't either one, and there are African words thrown in. There are Portuguese words, and so I felt a lot better. And then it took me another year until I was able to parse at least a large percentage of Sonantongo when it was being when native people are speaking it. So, yeah, that's it can be a lot when you hear a Creole language, because you think oh yeah, I'm hearing a lot of words that I'm familiar with. It's pretty simple. Yeah, I mean, but learning the language is learning a language. So
Yeah, all of that nuance.
Right.
And yeah,
Right.
because and this is what we learn from Creole languages. They show us that language is human, and language develops to express human thought and emotion. And so any language that is regularly spoken, and as you say, that inner that thought language, L1, is going to necessarily be that complex enough to do that, and which is astoundingly complex if you stop and look at what language does.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, last couple of things here. The number of Creole languages. So, like I said, I think the default, at least in the United States, is when we hear Creole, unless you're a linguist, you think Haitian Creole, and that is probably for a good reason. There are over 7 million speakers of Haitian Creole. It is the largest Creole language, and so, especially where that's on the same general neighborhood as the United States, it makes sense that would be the one that you would default to, one that you've probably run across before, someone that speaks Haitian Creole. It is, however, just one of probably over 100 Creole languages spoken in the world. Now, I say probably because the number of Creole languages is hard to really nail down, because they're often not super well documented. And that is one thing I wanted to touch on, and then I spaced it. So let's come back to it really quick. Writing a Creole language is often the last step in it becoming a full-fledged language, and often not one that is really undertaken seriously for decades after the Creole, if not longer, maybe even longer in the case of some of these Creole languages, that they've existed for a long time without really a written form. And so I know, and once again, my anecdotal experience with Sonoran is a lot of people didn't know how to read it. A lot of people that spoke the language had no familiarity with how to read Sonoran, because there wasn't really a unified form of Sonoran. The spelling was just all over the place. It depended on your L1 to some extent and how you thought a word was spelled. If you're a Dutch speaker that learned Sonoran, you spelled the Sonoran words like a Dutch person would. If you're an English speaker that learned Sonoran, you spell it like an English person would. And then all the people that there are a lot of people from India over there. I mean, they have their influence for L1 influence. Anyway, the orthography, the writing of the Sonoran is standardized technically, but even now, it is not the case that the majority of speakers care as much about how they're told to spell it. They'll spell words however they want, if they ever write it, which is infrequent, because they all have their L1s, and Sonoran is rarely an L1 still. It is, for some people, it is a full-fledged Creole, but most people speak a different L1, and then Sonoran, as Creoles are wont, is frequently a lingua franca. That means the language of the streets. It's how people communicate. And so orthography is very unique, because often these are just fully verbal languages, and so it's hard to figure out the exact rules of the language when nobody can write it down for you. Tim, did you have any insight into that?
Well, I think just the nature of Creoles, that you would see that in all Creoles, I think, because they are by nature, they're non-standard, right? These are languages that not only haven't been around a long time to be standardized, but also are often created at the margins of a society. Take Suriname, for example. The language of prestige in Suriname would be Dutch, I presume. And so that's the
cool.
one where in situations where people are concerned about writing and spelling, so Saranan Tongo is just not going to be, as like worried about.
Correct. You're right. Yep. The academic pursuit of language is not applied. The rules of academia are not applied to Saranan Tongo. Once again, anecdotally, anytime you're in kind of a higher class place, you can hear it in the language. Suddenly, everyone is speaking Dutch. As soon as you go into a nice restaurant, as soon as you are in circles of people that are kind of higher class, they all know Saranan Tongo, but they wouldn't be caught speaking it among themselves because they kind of look down on it. And so it is only in the poorest people that speak it at home amongst each other, and or mixed families of coming from different countries. A number of people, the husband or wife was born in Suriname, grew up in Suriname, and married a Guyanese person who speaks English. And so then the only language that they can speak with each other is Saranan Tongo. So then that would be the language spoken at home. So that is a scenario where then once again the children and the family all interact in Saranan Tongo. And anyway, there are lots of cases where Creole languages fit these very unique niche situations. And generally the higher up the social order you go, the less you hear this Creole language, at least in Suriname. It's not. I'd imagine that it's different in different countries, but I don't know. I mean, like you said, a lot of the history that we've talked about already about Creole languages leads you to a similar type of setup, where the language of the economic power is going to be the one that you want to speak in order to move up the social ladder, whereas the language of the Creole is maybe potentially looked down on. I think some countries have moved beyond that to some extent, but like I said, in my anecdotal experience, it is the case that it's, at least as of 15 years ago, it was still the case.
And I think that it's going to be true in any case where the language, the Creole language, doesn't become the standard language of the population. I think so. For example, I think most colonized places are going to be like Suriname, where you're going to have the Creole is commonly spoken, but it's not the language of prestige. A couple of exceptions would probably be Haitian Creole, right? Where
Right.
and of course that happened. That probably wouldn't have happened if the Haitian Revolution hadn't been successful. In places where the where the colonial power was not ousted forcibly, like in Suriname. You didn't have that total expulsion, and so the colonial languages remain.
Yeah, though it is interesting. Sorry not to interrupt, but once again, anecdotally, the Dutch in Suriname, the majority of people in Suriname, once again, based on my anecdotal experience, aren't particularly fond of the Dutch. And so there is a segment of the population that really doesn't want much to do with the Dutch language, but most of them view it more as kind of a means to an end. They still don't like the Dutch, but they view the Dutch language as a stepping stone for money and power. And so, but as of, I don't know, 15 years ago, once again, they're one of the major politicians in Suriname just refused to speak Dutch. He just said, look, I'm going to speak Saranan. I'm going to speak Saranan Tongo, and that is our language, and I don't want anything to do with this Dutch anymore.
And I expect that one of the factors too is the homogeneity of the population. Suriname still has a very diverse population, whereas you look at say in Haiti, the population was I don't suppose homogeneous is the right word, but at this point in their history, that you've got a relatively homogeneous population.
Yeah. As soon as you could, the number of speakers. Once again, going back to, I guess, the number of speakers, it's going to affect the ability that that language has to give you any type of social leg up or power or feel comfortable in a particular language. If you speak a language that is not spoken by more than 10,000 people, 100,000 people, you're aware that it's not particularly powerful. And so, yeah, and then there's all the history, all the things you're just talking about, Tim, just the history of the colonization and just how historically Creole languages have been kind of looked down on, Creole people kind of viewed as maybe not as good. And so, unfortunately, the stigma passes on.
I wonder if another example of a standardized Creole language that's been adopted, and I don't know much about it, but talk pidgin, the Creole language of Papua New Guinea and kind of the Pacific Islands. Like from what I understand, it's kind of like it's pretty standardized. Like it's written and used pretty much in that one. I wonder if it's come to be associated with urban areas, and so I wonder if that hasn't lent it a kind of status. This is the language of the big city, because it's when all these people coming from all over had to adopt this language to communicate with each other. Anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, that is a good point, because among these lists of Creole languages that I was looking up, there are a number, but not a large number. We're talking like somewhere between 5 and 10 Creole languages that have been made the official language of the country, and that one, talk pidgin or whatever it is the I don't know if it's the only, but it is an official language of Papua New Guinea. Which then leads you to the number of speakers. The numbers I was seeing is there's just over 100,000 native speakers, but there are over 4 million second language speakers of that language.
Wow.
So,
what an indicator of status, right? This is a language people are striving to learn.
Right. Yeah.
Huh.
So, yeah, it's viewed as useful in some way. Exactly. So. And there are a few in Africa as well that have been adopted as the national language, Congo, Kituba. Anyway, there are a number of Creole languages that are moving out of that status. And so I guess the takeaway for this podcast as we wrap up here is to kind of view Creole languages as a unique window to the mind and to the linguistic process, and that these are languages that can be studied, that can be learned, and by no means should they be viewed as anything less. They are unique, and they're pretty cool. Tim, last thought?
Mele kalikimaka.
That's okay.
It's Hawaiian Creole. Actually, I'm not sure if that's Hawaiian Creole or, well, it's probably but there was a Creole language spoken in Hawaii, and so that's. Anyways, we could break that one down all day, but there you go.
Okay. Yeah. Tim the lead Lemming Cox.
I want business cards that say
that. Matt, did you have any insights into Creoles before we wrap up here?
I think you guys covered it really well.
We had Dr. McWhorter on our side.
Yeah, that's right.
Sure, he would co-sign all of the information that we disseminated.
We'll have him on next time.
So. That's cool, but this isn't learn it from doctors. This is learn it from. We have a surprising amount of doctors on this.
Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable.
Thing we do.
Yeah. We're able to manage that by dumbing down the other half of the podcast participants.
And that's why I hold down the fort here. Let's bring everyone down to my level. Yeah, there's a whole world of languages to go out there and learn. And I'd be interested, Tim, maybe A lot of people use like Duolingo, apps like that. I don't know whether or not, I'd imagine Haitian Creole is one of the languages you can learn. So go jump
bet,
on and
yeah.
start learning, and you'll find out some of the things that we learned in the podcast tonight. You'll see it really quick, just some of the different syntactic and lexical rules that apply to Haitian Creole. And for us English language learners, or probably in that case French, it'll probably be a little bit easier than going out there and trying Russian or German or Chinese. So
Everything's easier than any Chinese language.
all right. Well, thank you for joining the podcast. We'll be back again next episode, and we'll see you then.